Hi, I'm Ezra Zuckerman of CI'20, and I'm very happy to be with you today to share just a few sociological ruminations that I've sort of labeled de-densifying collective intelligence. What do I mean by that? So, why am I here? I think I'm here for one major reason, which is that Christoph Riedel, thank you for inviting me, saw a Twitter thread of mine. So I'm going to get to that Twitter thread. The other part to think about is that I'm not sure exactly why I'm here. I've never been, I don't know you folks that well on CIC. I've heard about it over the years, especially from my colleague Tom Malone. And so it's a little bit unclear how to approach an audience that I don't know and then on Zoom and all that. What I thought I'd do is just think through, going back to a little bit saying who I am. Imagine sort of the beginning of my career. There's a little bit of it. Someone had asked me what collective intelligence was, what made for more or less collective intelligence, what might I have said, and then how my thinking might have changed over the years. That's what I'll do. I think my answer would have been at the beginning of my career, if you would just ask me without allowing me to think very much, is I would have told you, okay, it's about a dense network. The denser the connections among the nodes, the people in the population, the more efficient the spread of the ideas and therefore more intelligent. After a little more thought, I think I would have come up with two caveats. This is sort of caveat 1A and caveat 1B. One caveat would have been, like, what do you mean by collectivity anyway? You can't just, I learned from Karl Marx, you can't just assume that all because, say, a set of nodes, or you put them together, even if they have the same interests, even if they occupy the same role, does that mean that they actually have class consciousness, they have collective consciousness, that they'll act for themselves? Does it mean that they'll be able to coordinate with each other? Not necessarily. We've got to think of that as being contingent. When does that happen, when it doesn't happen? The second caveat I think I would add would have to do with, well, how are you even, before we get to collective consciousness, how are you deciding who's in that population of interest, those nodes? How are you specifying the boundary? This is something that I learned a lot from highlighting here, a paper by my former advisor, Ed Lauman and colleagues. That's a really tough problem when you think about it. Mostly what we have is heuristics for solving that problem, not like a clear rationale often. A second caveat might come from thinking about work that I was already doing, continue to do, based on work of my other advisor, Ronald Burt, very influential book called Structural Holes. This is an image from it. He made a distinction building a Mark Granovetter, anticipating somewhat some other work, people working on bridges. Somewhat, you could think of this as a small world being connected by a shortcut, a bridge. In this case, Robert seemingly has at the individual level some advantages in the fact that he bridges to multiple clusters. They could have new ideas in each of those clusters that he's connecting and making the whole system perhaps more intelligent. In work that Ray Reagans and I did together, really actually just pulling out the logic of structural holes theory and reworking it a bit, what we can show is that that logic does hold, but it's a little tricky. And in particular, there's sort of a risk-return aspect to structural holes in the sense that before you build a bridge to a new cluster, new world, new neighborhood, you don't know what you're going to find. You don't know whether there's actually new information there. You don't know whether if it's information that someone else might need or not, such that there might be gains from trade. And so there's risk associated with it. So the more clusters you bridge, the more potential return, but you also take much more risk. And so as we build up towards thinking about collective intelligence, on the one hand, you might think, well, we don't actually need a fully dense network. All you need is bridges, but on the other hand, bridges can be risky. Okay. What I want to do is say a few things about my work over the years since then and how they might speak to conversations about collective intelligence. So one thing I'll highlight, I'll advertise a little bit, is some work I did with Stoyan Sugurev, a former student of mine. We made a discovery, an institution that had really gone unnoticed in the American economy. It's pretty prevalent. We did some work showing that. and we think it's prevalent in capitalist economies throughout the world. It's something we call the industry peer network. And there are a lot of related institutions that what they do is they facilitate the building of connections across parallel channels in our economy. And so what they do is they create connections among non-competing peer firms or individuals, and not just, and then bridges we're talking about. And these bridges are actually not just oftentimes, not just single links, but actually collectivities. So in this case, what we studied was consultancies and trade associations that would put together small groups of quite intimate and bounded, highly bounded groups that were meant to, were attractive to their members for their ability to stimulate learning and to push each other to higher performance. Very, very interesting institution, we thought. And part of what they're interesting is what they teach us about larger institutions they have around our economy and how they support different kinds of markets. Some of those markets are actually quite limited in doing the things we actually think markets are very good at doing, learning and motivating. And in particular, there are a lot of markets out there that are very opaque, not so transparent. It's hard to see or infer what peers are up, your peers are up to and learn from them. And actually, even though when you're sort of up against it and you're threatened with, and your firm is threatened their survival, that's very motivating. That's a different kind of motivation than you might get from peers. Say, in some sense of healthy social pressure, you can get sort of pushing each other to higher performance. That's coming from that. In that case, it's maybe collectivities for intelligence, individual intelligence, rather than an intelligence that's embedded in the collectivity per se. This interest that I've started to develop around less about networks, so much as about institutions and organizations, is reflected in the next set of pieces of research that I'll sort of summarize. An abiding interest of mine, and why is it that markets are actually much less intelligent than we might think, and actually misvalue things quite often. So and a particular interest of mine has been over the years has been in why it is that assets, firms, individuals that don't fit neatly into the categories that organize valuation suffer a discount or are traded sort of or inefficiently. But more generally, you could think about classic inefficiencies. Here's an example from the NASDAQ bubble, the tech bubble from the late 90s. And so what's going on? And so two general lessons that I've been interested in that I've taken out and built on other work, certainly that I've learned since when I was a young network analyst. So one, I think really, really important paradox. If you're want to understand valuation in financial markets, asset markets, you have to recognize this paradox that kind of like authoritarian regimes, which in the first instance are like the opposites in the sense that markets have free choice. You can connect to anybody. You can build whatever bridge you want versus authoritarian regimes in which you are restricted. Both settings, though, are marked by a suppression of negative views, of dissent, and that distorts valuations. Classic paper on this is by Edward Miller, 1977, Journal of Finance. And all he said was basically, let's assume there's a spread of opinion that people don't converge on the same valuation, pretty reasonable, quite at odds with what was then the dominant view, the orthodox efficient markets approach. And what he showed was actually the more there's heterogeneity opinion, if you assume that it's difficult to express a negative view, then when you take all those negative views, it's the heterogeneity that will actually drive price. Now, why did he say that it was difficult to express a negative view? Well, it turns out that's actually quite general, as I mentioned. And there's a really important asymmetry in markets. So if prices are too low, in your view, if you think prices are very low relative to the intrinsic value of an asset, there's something you can always do, and that doesn't require any social risk. And so if you're, say, Warren Buffett in particular, what you do is you buy the company, take it off the market, and you earn the income from that company. And if you're right, no problem. You've now bought an asset on the cheap. If prices are too high, though, in your estimation, what you can do is very limited. But Buffett never takes those kinds of positions. What you can do is you can express a short position. But short positions are very risky, and actually, a lot of times you can't even express a short position. This is the basis for a key ingredient in the real estate bubble of the late aughts, or of the aughts, was the fact that you couldn't short real estate. Interestingly, Miller's paper basically got relatively little attention for about 20 years until it finally started to take off. Actually around the time of the tech bubble, and where people are very interested because short sale constraints were a big part of that story. So the paper itself reflects essentially limitations in the efficiency of the market for science, something that I've also been quite interested in, published a recent paper with Pierre Azulaya. This second point I want to make has to do with coordination more generally. So it's true on the negative side if you're trying to express a negative view, but it's also true on the positive side, to the extent that in order to realize a return in markets or in any setting, to the extent that that depends on what other people's valuations is, you've got a coordination problem on your hands. You've got to somehow anticipate and somehow coordinate with others to get to ensure that the valuation is going to be the right evaluation. And this is very, very hard. And that's another reason why it takes a while for markets to turn through wrong theories. That's this internet stock paper, wrong ideas about liquidity. And it can be that actually people will go along with the wrong valuation for quite a while. They'll dance for quite a while. The larger problem here, and I've worked on this in a bunch of different domains, is how to shift valuations off, in some sense, a misvaluation when, and it's very, very hard when it's a coordination problem. I've done some work on status hierarchies where this is really important. One of the reasons why there are status advantages for high status actors, individuals, institutions, is not so much because they're actually perceived as being higher quality. It's because everybody knows that everybody knows. That is, it's common knowledge. People coordinate with respect to these status, and that then becomes hard to shift. Same is true for categorizations. Category schemes have this feature as well. And in both cases, it can often be the case as well. It's not so much just what everybody knows that everybody knows. It's what everybody wants to know that everybody wants to know. That is, people are committed to those category schemes, and that makes it hard to shift as well. So again, you get misvaluations. I want to come back to that Twitter thread, and I'll finish with that and say another word. So that Twitter thread was about openings for change and why it is that actually, because of this logic, change can actually happen very rapidly. And so there's actually some interesting convergence here across different lines of work in the social sciences. Nothing, hard to think of literatures that seem very more different than works on than literature on bubbles and crashes, financial markets, and then literature on scandal. But Arya Dutt's very important work on scandal, shows something very similar to the work on bubbles, which is there can be a lot of knowledge that's out in the system, in this case about social deviance, knowing that there's been deviance or someone who's broken social norms. But things don't change until there's a public signal that shows that now everybody knows that everyone knows that it's true. And then since everybody kind of knew it already anyway, it's easy to switch to the new valuation. It happens very rapidly in a scandal. So scandal is about disruptive publicity, about the publicity of things that actually people maybe already knew. I think something similar was going on in that shift that I talked about earlier. So when Jim Clyburn embraced Joe Biden, and then the next day, I think it was the South Carolina primary, what you saw was this really wholesale shift. And I think what was going on essentially was that everybody was looking for who was going to be the safe choice, essentially. Who was going to be the standard bearer for the people who were not for Bernie, but could oppose Trump. And that sent a public signal, the Clyburn in South Carolina, that, okay, Biden is fine, we'll go with him. And everybody knew that they were saying that, and everybody shifted. Last thing I want to say, some work that I've done, I think that, so in thinking about how change happens and how effective coordination can happen, I've done some work, and in this case with Bob Freeland, and I want to highlight the work of Catherine Turco as well, and thinking about how it is that formal organizations can be as effective as they can when they are. And a key ingredient is their ability to shape common knowledge, and therefore facilitate coordination. The hierarchy of the firm, and particularly the voice rights that are at the heart of that hierarchy, are key to that. You can look at it on the negative side, which is if you have a three-headed CEO, three-headed voice at the top, you get a cacophony that leads to confusion. But if you have a single voice and it's used carefully, it can facilitate and coordinate, make it quite a collectively intelligent organization in at least some very well-known cases. In some of those cases, it can be quite inspiring. I look forward to engaging with all of you in the Q&A. Thank you.